Remember when you bought your first mirrorless camera and thought that you would finally be able to produce high quality cinematic videos, but as soon as you stepped into a basketball gym and turned it on, you quickly realized that your footage wasn't nearly as good as you expected it to be. Local gyms are often much darker than we think, and inexperienced sports videographers with budget cameras tend to end up with footage looking like this. Basically grainy as hell and even kinda blurry. But the good news is that when shooting sports in low light conditions, even with a budget camera, in reality you're only 5 settings away from producing footage as clean and as sharp as this. Hey guys, my name is E. I'm a professional sports videographer, and the purpose of my YouTube channel is to give you the tools and knowledge necessary to help you start your sports videography career. And today I want to achieve that by making you a much better shooter in low light conditions. To do that, there are 5 settings that you absolutely need to get right, especially if you own a crop sensor / APS-C camera like the Sony ZV-E10 or the A6400. These cameras are cheap mainly because of their smaller sensors, but a smaller sensor lets in less light, so it often struggles in low light conditions a lot more than the bigger sensor of a full frame camera like my Sony FX3 for example. So if you own a budget camera, I strongly recommend that you follow my low light settings recipe to a T. But if you have a full frame camera, then obviously there's a lot more wiggle room for you to play with. But either way, if anything is unclear or if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments below. The first setting we need to adjust is the frame rate. We need to keep it as low as possible. So if need be ready to sacrifice the ability to slow down your footage in post by shooting at a 24 frames per second frame rate. Yes, it sucks to lose the ability to produce slow-mos, but it's actually good for your creativity to work only in full speed once in a while. It forces you to find new ways to be creative without relying on speed ramping so much. Anyway, using the lowest frame rate available, in this case 24, allows us to let in the maximum amount of light into our camera. Even going from 30 to 24 frames per second can make a big difference in the end. And that's because of the second setting that we need to adjust, which is the shutter speed. Our shutter speed also needs to be at a minimum, but we can't go lower than double our frame rate. So by using a 24 frames per second frame rate instead of 30, at least we're able to use a 1/50 shutter speed instead of 1/60. The third setting we need to adjust is the aperture. And this one might cost you a little bit of money because ideally you want to keep your aperture at an f-stop value somewhere between f2.8 and f4. Because the higher that number is, the darker your image gets. So f4 is basically the highest value that I recommend in low light conditions. So if you only have a budget lens with a variable aperture of f3.5 to 6.3 for example, I suggest that you start saving your money for a wide aperture lens. I've recommended a few of those lenses in the past and you can find them all through a link in the description below. The next setting we need to adjust is the ISO. And that one is a little bit tricky because just like the others, we want to keep it at a minimum, but in a dark gym, that's just not realistic. So assuming that your frame rate is at 24, that your shutter speed is at 1/50, and your aperture is at f2.8, it is okay to push your ISO up in order to expose your shot properly, but only up to a certain degree though. Here are the maximum ISO settings that I recommend for each type of sensor, but keep in mind that those are just suggestions, not exact science. So on a full frame camera, keep your ISO at 6400 or lower. On an APS-C or crop sensor camera, keep your ISO at 3200 or lower. And on a micro four third camera, keep your ISO at 1600 or lower. But please remember that in all cases, the lower you go, the cleaner your image will be. The last setting we need to talk about is the picture profile. If your camera records in 10-bit color, especially if it's a full frame camera, I strongly recommend you to film with a flat profile, ideally a log profile, so that you can control the quality of your image by color grading it in post-production. But if you have a budget camera that only records in 8-bit color, again, I'm talking to my ZV-E10 and A6400 owners, if that's the case, then doing too much transformation to your image in post is probably going to do more harm than good. So for that reason, I recommend using a picture profile that already looks good straight out of camera so that you only have to do minor tweaks in color correction if need be. I won't tell you which profile to pick exactly because different cameras have different options and also because it is very subjective. But I do want you to pick a picture profile that has a lot of, well, maybe not a lot, but a reasonable amount of contrast because contrast does help hide noise in the shadows. On that note, make sure to put those settings to the test the next time you film a sporting event in a dark gym and let me know how it went. Otherwise, for affordable lens recommendations specifically for low light conditions, check out the video on your screen right now.